Protecting Youth in Rural Areas, Accessible Mental Health Services. Over half of youth in rural areas encounter inadequate access to pediatric psychiatrists. There are higher rates of suicide among youth living in rural areas than other populations, calling for an effective method to increase accessibility for mental health services. Thompson highlights that the primary reason that Simone Biles withdrew from the Olympics was the mental impacts which anxiety had on her. If a legendary Olympian is restrained due to her anxiety, how are children expected to overcome mental illness without proper support? Zanet et al. Concludes that PTSD is evolutionary. This means that there is little that can be done to proactively prevent mental health issues, showing that reactive measures such as services must be emphasized. Thompson and Zanet's research collectively convey that because mental illness has a widespread and profound influence, it's imperative that there's access to mental health services for everyone, including youth living in rural areas of America. This points to the question, why is it necessary to increase accessibility of mental health services for youth living in rural areas of America? The examination of medical, social, and political lenses prove that telemental health expansion and revision is necessary as it will effectively increase the accessibility of mental health services for youth living in rural areas of America. From a medical lens, there are risks for rural youth not having access to mental health services. Pediatrician and former Surgeon General of California, Nadine Burke-Harris, conveys that exposure to early adversity affects specific areas of the brain, making children more liable to heart disease or cancer. However, this could be prevented if children had access to mental health services, but rural youth do not have this access. This pie chart shows that 3% of rural areas have access to a mental health institution which has suicide prevention services for children, and this is compared to 8% of metropolitan areas, and so on. This therefore shows that the health risks for youth plus the under-resources for rural populations combine to demonstrate dire health consequences for youth living in rural areas. Some rural youth, however, more urgently need these services than others. From a social lens, for example, minority youth have less access to mental health services than others. 36% of Latino and Hispanic Americans with mental health issues received services. This is versus 52% of non-Hispanic whites with mental illness who receive services. This gap illustrates barriers for Latino and Hispanic Americans with mental illness as they can't access these services. It's plausible that minority populations' inaccessibility would be exacerbated if they were youth living in rural areas. Experts often attempt to find reasons for this inaccessibility. Political difficulties are frequently pointed at when examining barriers. This is apparent from the perspective of Sharia Vromnegi, an adolescent with depression and bipolar disorder living in rural California. NPR explains that Vromnegi's post-suicide attempt doctors, quote, wanted to keep her longer, but the insurance companies wouldn't cover it, end quote. This refusal from insurance companies conveys violations of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008, an act which prevents large-scale insurance companies from denying coverage of mental health services. To combat this collective evidence, expansion of telemental health, or TMH, is most plausible. TMH is therapy which uses online communication. Online TMH services show to be, quote, feasible, preferred, and easy to apply for youth, end quote, with mental health issues, such as OCD, thus illustrating the efficiency of TMH as this treatment of mental health disorders will prevent outcomes like cancer or heart disease, which was previously illustrated by Harris to be more likely to occur without these services. To further support TMH, this solution was feasible on Latino youth, which makes it plausible that the solution will be similarly feasible on youth living in rural areas, due to them both being under-resourced. However, this solution is limited, first because additional research must be done to ensure that there are not any other exterior reasons which prevent youth living in rural areas from accessing therapy. TMH only addresses physical barriers, so if there's a larger, overarching problem, then TMH would be unproductive. Secondly, a concern regarding TMH is that it's inferior to in-person services. Lanzarenzetta et al. Langzer et al. Explains that online services have communication barriers, which disrupts children from having good therapy. However, there is simply a lack of quantitative research supporting that this disruption actively reduces patients' quality of therapy. By not implementing TMH for unsupported reasons would be inappropriate, considering that Orsolini and Castro et al. Found research about the positives of TMH. There are reforms that must be done to existing mental health programs and TMH programs. One youth member explained that reaching out to TMH over the phone gives youth anxiety, making them uncomfortable to reach out to this program. In order to increase accessibility, TMH should be reformed in order to allow patients to choose a mode of communication, either call, text, or video call. Further, it's vital that TMH is reformed to ensure that psychiatrists are trained to effectively use TMH, including that they confirm the privacy of the patients, as it's commonly shown that patients feel a lack of privacy using TMH. An alternative solution is the expansion of in-person mental health services. This has already been attempted by the Biden-Harris administration, and it was reported that it overall increased accessibility. Despite this, Rome Nagy still had to drive 1.5 hours after her suicide attempt to the nearest suitable hospital, proving that the solution hasn't adequately increased accessibility for all, making the solution meaningless and pointing the best solution back to TMH. A limitation is that when using evidence about youth living in rural areas, the information is frequently the combination of information about youth and information about rural areas, rather than information about youth living in rural areas. Furthermore, certain heavily relied on sources were unscholarly. Mental health issues for youth living in rural areas has prevailed, causing increased chances for this population to have dire consequences. It is the duty of Americans to push the needle forward bit by bit to ensure that future generations have the necessary services that they need. And this should be started through reforming and expanding telemental health services, according to evidence. Thank you. Here's my
Okay, excellent, Irina. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're gonna go through the oral defense. So for the first oral defense question, how did you handle the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
Can you repeat that question?
How did you handle the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
So a lot of my perspectives were differing. For example, the perspectives of Latino and Hispanic Americans differed from Langzer-Renza's research. And in order to reach a conclusion based over this, I examined each of their perspectives and found which one is more reliable. For example, for Latino and Hispanic Americans solution, they pointed to TMH services because they found that this solution was feasible for them. And for Langzer-Renza, he found that TMH was not feasible because it has communication barriers. However, his research makes no sense in comparison to Latino and Hispanics research, because if it's feasible for them, then there shouldn't be any communication barriers. So because of this, I more so focused heavily on the Latino and Hispanics opinion. So in short, to handle differing perspectives, I examined their arguments to find which one was more plausible.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move on to the second oral defense question. If you had more time, what additional research would you conduct related to this issue?
If I had more time, I would have conducted information about the economic lens of this issue. This is because there might be an economic reason that youth living in rural areas can't access these mental health services. And by neglecting to look at this issue, then I'm making my solution less plausible for this population. For example, if the issue is affordability, then TMH wouldn't work for it, since TMH focuses more on accessibility than affordability. So if I had more time, I would focus more on the economic lens.
Okay, thank you so much.